Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a truly fascinating global phenomenon. We're going to look at how a policy, one that was actually originally designed as a quick, temporary labor fix, ended up transforming an entire nation's economy. And not just that, it fundamentally shaped the global workforce as we know it today. We're talking, of course, about the Overseas Filipino Workers, or OFWs. If you've ever wondered how labor migration works on a massive, state-sponsored scale, well, you're definitely in the right place. Let's get into it.
Let's kick things off with a staggering number. $36 billion. That's the estimated amount in US dollars of annual remittances sent back home by these workers. To put that into perspective, we aren't just talking about extra spending money here. This money literally serves as the primary economic engine for the entire Philippines. It's paying for education, it's funding housing, and it's driving everyday household consumption across the country. But how exactly did we get here?
Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, we'll look at the multi-billion-dollar phenomenon. Second, who are the OFWs? Third, the top global destinations. Fourth, a temporary fix made permanent. And finally, number 5, the remittance trap.
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the multi-billion-dollar phenomenon.
2.7 million. According to the Department of Migrant Workers, this was the record number of worker departures recorded in 2025 alone. That is a massive 15.4% jump from just the previous year. Just imagine the pure logistics of processing, deploying, and tracking the movement of nearly 3 million workers in a single 12-month window. It's a logistical mountain.
Now, tracking this massive workforce is actually so incredibly complex that you often see two entirely different sets of headline figures floating around out there. And it's pretty important to understand why. So the Philippine Statistics Authority, or PSA, uses a household survey to estimate the total stock of active workers, and they put the number at around 2.19 million. Meanwhile, the Department of Migrant Workers, the DMW, they track the actual annual departures, which gives us that 2.7 million figure. So, different methodologies, right? But they both point to the exact same reality. You have millions of citizens actively engaged in overseas labor right now.
And that huge workforce, it generates some massive returns. If we break down the record-breaking cash remittances from 2025, which hit $35.63 billion, you can clearly see the two main categories of workers. You've got land-based workers, who sent home the lion's share at $28.49 billion, and then you have sea-based workers. These are the seafarers working on international shipping lines, cruise ships, tankers, and they brought in $7.14 billion. You put that all together, and it represents roughly 7.3% of the entire Philippine GDP.
Moving on to Section 2, who are the OFWs? Let's look at the demographics.
Now, what's really interesting here is that the data shatters a few common stereotypes. You might naturally picture the typical migrant worker as a guy working in construction or an industrial plant. But if we look at the land-based OFWs, the workforce is actually predominantly female. Women make up 57.8% of the total, compared to 42.2% for men.
Another thing that might surprise you is their age. The largest single age bracket is 45 and up, which represents over a quarter of the entire workforce. That's followed by folks in their early and late 30s. So what does this tell us? It means we're not looking at an entry-level workforce of fresh grads just trying to gain some quick experience. This is a dedicated mid-career workforce. And geographically speaking, over 60% of these workers hail from the Luzon Island group.
When we zoom in on the occupational breakdown, the data skews pretty heavily toward lower-skilled and semi-skilled work. Almost 44% work in what are officially classified as elementary occupations. This includes things like cleaning, food prep, deliveries, and domestic work. Plant and machine operators make up over 15%, while skilled trades and technical professionals, like nurses and engineers, account for smaller shares. On a global scale, domestic work and seafaring remain the two largest single job categories by far.
Okay, Section 3. Top global destinations. Where is everybody actually going?
Well, before we look at the top destinations, there's a really critical distinction we need to make. Where the money comes from and where contract workers actually go are two totally different maps. The United States actually sends the vast majority of the money back, nearly 40% of it in fact. But that's because the US, along with Canada and parts of Europe, hosts large numbers of highly educated permanent migrants. We're talking nurses and IT professionals who've been settled there for decades. However, when we talk about temporary contract labor being deployed right now, today, that map shifts dramatically over to the Middle East and Asia.
Take a look at the actual labor deployment in 2025. Notice that the United Arab Emirates has taken the #1 spot, finally overtaking Saudi Arabia as the largest single market. The UAE pulls in a huge, diverse variety of workers. everyone from domestic and construction workers to hospitality staff and white-collar professionals. Saudi Arabia is still a massive hub, of course, especially for construction, domestic help, and healthcare. And coming in at number 3, we have Singapore, which has this really fascinating split demand for both domestic helpers and highly specialized finance and tech professionals.
Let's move to Section 4 and see how this builds a temporary fix made permanent.
The evolution of Philippine labor export actually traces all the way back to 1906. That's when 15 sugarcane farmers, known as Sakadas, were recruited to work over in Hawaii. But the modern system as we know it, that was formalized much later, in 1974. Facing high domestic unemployment, soaring inflation, and an oil crisis, President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. signed the Labor Code under martial law. This decree established state-managed overseas employment. The thing is, it was originally intended as a temporary stopgap. It was just supposed to manage unemployment and capture some desperately needed foreign exchange during the Middle East oil boom. But as we see culminating with the creation of an entirely dedicated Department of Migrant Workers in 2022, well, it didn't stay temporary. So how did the subsequent governments adapt to the reality that this temporary fix wasn't going anywhere? Under Corazon Aquino's administration in the 1980s, we saw the emergence of a very specific, very powerful phrase, Bagong Bayani, which translates to new heroes. This was a pivotal moment in the government's messaging. It shifted the framing of mass labor migration. Instead of it being viewed as a failure of domestic job creation, it was transformed into this patriotic narrative of sacrifice for the nation's economy. The temporary stopgap was essentially, culturally and politically, institutionalized.
Finally, let's get into Section 5, the remittance trap.
The most immediate driver for the individual worker is, quite frankly, the wage gap. Whether you're a lower-skilled domestic worker or a highly trained nurse, you can earn anywhere from 4 to 10 times more overseas than you would doing the exact same job back home once you factor in currency conversion. That staggering differential makes overseas work the absolute quickest vehicle for upward socioeconomic mobility. For a lot of families, it really isn't a choice. It's just basic economic math.
So the crucial point is that you have several massive structural forces reinforcing each other to keep this whole cycle going. First, the Philippines produces an oversupply of college-educated and skilled workers that the domestic economy simply can't absorb. Second, as we just saw, those extreme wage differentials pull those workers abroad. Third, households have become fundamentally dependent on these remittances just to survive, paying for things like schooling and healthcare. And finally, there's institutional self-perpetuation. I mean, an entire government apparatus and recruitment industry now exists solely to facilitate this labor export. To fix this, you'd face the monumental task of absorbing the massive job creation gap and the remittance income gap at the exact same time.
And we really cannot understate the scale of that structural dependence. Like we mentioned earlier, remittances make up 7.3% of the Philippine GDP. Because this money flows directly into the pockets of families rather than passing through government budgets, it acts as a massive financial safety net. In many ways, you could argue it's become a politically convenient substitute for the state having to build enough high-paying domestic jobs or robust social services itself.
Which leaves us with this final, vital question to ponder. Given the deep structural reliance on the billions of dollars flowing into the country every single year, will the domestic economy ever be able to absorb its own workforce? Or has the export of human capital simply become a permanent reality? It is a complex economic puzzle with millions of lives right at its center. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I definitely encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating topic.